My name is Victor Fuhrman. Some call me the Voice. I've always been fascinated with human nature, spirituality, science, and the crossroads at which they meet. Join me now and we will explore these topics and so much more with fascinating guests, authors, and experts who will guide us to Destination Unlimited. Most Americans believe the United States was founded by pious Christians. However, as my guest this week on Destination Unlimited, Ronnie Pontiac, reveals, from the very beginning, America was a vibrant blend of beliefs from all four corners of the world. Ronnie Pontiac worked as Manly P. Hall's research assistant, screener, and designated substitute lecturer for 7 years. He has produced award-winning documentaries and has written for Invisible College Magazine, Newtopia, Metapsychosis, A Cult of Personality, and the original Reality Sandwich. He lives in Los Angeles. He may be found on Instagram and Facebook, and he joins me this week to share his path and new book, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. Please join me in welcoming to Destination Unlimited, Ronnie Pontiac. Welcome, Ronnie.
I'm very happy to be here, Victor.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled that you're joining us and sharing this amazing work, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. Listeners, this book is nearly 600 pages, and Ronnie's research and the sharings in his book are absolutely amazing. This is a page-turner, folks, so make sure you go out and get a copy as soon as possible. We'll be talking about where you can get the book later on in the show. Ronnie, please share with our listeners your path prior to meeting and working with Manly Palmer Hall.
Well, I was a good example of lead in the alchemical process. I was raised by war refugees who were atheists, beat up all through school, and felt like there was no social contract for me. So by the time I was 17, I was a petty criminal, and I was a frontman for a band that was nihilist, and I would even say somewhat fascist, and had a big following in the Southern California area. It was a miracle in itself that no one got harmed, including myself, from my antics at that time. My only interest in the occult then was I had some interest in Crowley and some interest in witchcraft and Satanism, but mostly as a means to power. And I saw them as the only other game in town, in a sense. And so since I did not feel any sense of loyalty to the prevailing order, I decided that I would use the rebellion, as it were, to gain my own power in my life. And then, fortunately, I fell in love. And not too long after that, I found a copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, the 6th edition, which is a reduced size, but still a large tome. The pictures are black and white rather than color in it, but it looked to me like some amazing book of magic from another century. And when I brought it home, each chapter that I read seemed to just open up a new area of my mind. And I couldn't wait to share with Tamara, my girlfriend at the time, what I was experiencing. So that's basically my path before I met him.
So that's what actually piqued your interest in the esoteric metaphysical.
Yes. I mean, I had always had an interest in things like Atlantis. And I remember seeing a book called Atlantis, Mother of Empires. And that was really the first time that a metaphysically inclined book attracted me. And I desperately wanted to shoplift it, but it was way too big. And years later, actually, when I found Secret Teachings of All Ages, I was at the Bodhi Tree bookstore with birthday money that was supposed to have been used for a haircut. And I couldn't find a copy of Atlantis, Mother of Empires, but I found instead The Secret Teachings, which turned out to be most fortuitous.
Wonderful. You know, it's interesting. Before we started recording the show, I was telling you that I grew up in the 50s and 60s here in New York. And in those days, the only place you could get metaphysical, occult, or esoteric books was Samuel Weiser's bookstore in Lower Manhattan here in New York City. And now today, you can get them virtually anywhere, right?
Even at Walmart.
Even at Walmart. Before we talk about Manly Palmer Hall, tell us about your band a little bit.
The current band?
the former band and the current band, yes.
The former band was just an expression of teenage angst and nihilism. I felt that there were a lot of people who were left out of the party culture of rock and roll, who were quite hostile, and I was one of them, and I wanted to unite them with songs that were really bitter and vengeful, and it turned out to be wildly successful for the time that I was able to sustain it. And my current band, Lucid Nation, it started out as a Riot Grrrl band. Riot Grrrl was a subdivision of punk that was pretty much run by women and was strongly feminist. And it was an amazing experience to go through that world as a male, to observe what women had gone through, and also to be inspired by their creativity, their incredible writing and music. And then over time, Lucid Nation kind of morphed into various other kinds of music, just depending on who we were playing with, because we had a band of gypsies attitude. We didn't really want to, we have toured nationally, but we didn't really want to do the whole release a record, do a video, go touring, try to make it, try to be famous, even though we had opportunities to do that, because Danny Goldberg and other music business executives that had power were fans of ours. But we had become a band just after Kurt Cobain's suicide, and we thought that it had something to do with the music business at the time. And so we resisted that. And the whole Riot Grrrl motif was to be anti-corporate and to be DIY. And since Manly Hall had been DIY, that strongly appealed to us. So we were DIY all through it. And we tried every kind of music in the guitar format, and some not. Romping through deconstruction of almost everything that's happened in that style of music over the last 30 or 40 years.
Thank you for sharing that with us. So tell us about Manly Palmer Hall, his body of work, and how you became his research assistant.
Well, he's an amazing scholar, in my opinion, and in some ways rather unique. When he started out, he was born in 1901. When he came to Los Angeles, there were still wooden sidewalks here. And wow. Yeah, and he had a grandmother who was really into Theosophy and Blavatsky, and these were strong influences on him as he was growing up. He wound up lecturing at a very young age and was an instant hit. He was so eloquent and so knowledgeable. And then I think he was only in his mid-20s when he put together The Secret Teachings, which was, of course, a much more complicated name in its original edition, which is called the Encyclopedic Outline. And he did this with the help of his community, of this community that adopted him, that was called the Church of Light. And I remember him telling stories about how they would all be sitting around someone's living room with all these different ideas about maybe this illustration should go here and that illustration here with this text, and how exciting it was to see this thing forming with the help of his friends. And on the basis of that book, which was the ultimate encyclopedia of Western esotericism at the time, he was able to establish himself as an author, a teacher, and a lecturer. And he started something called the Philosophical Research Society in Los Feliz, California. And it has a beautiful library with his collection in it. At one time, he had a vault filled with amazing rare manuscripts and books in the areas of Rosicrucianism, alchemy, and much more. And so he created this amazing community, and we didn't get there. My wife and I, she became my wife because he wanted us to get married, and he actually officiated the ceremony in his backyard. He was already in his 80s at that point, and most of the people working there were much older. And I strongly doubt that we would have made it into his inner circle any other time. But when we got there, it was such a humble place and so friendly, and they were so sweet to us. It was amazing. And I got involved with him because to go back a little bit, at the time when you mentioned in our conversation before this about the ARE, and I had a friend who was really into the idea that Earth changes were imminent and they were moving to Virginia Beach. And this was the same person that when I came to them with The Secret Teachings of All Ages saying, wow, have you ever seen this? She laughed and said, oh yeah. Well, he just lectures down the street from you. And I was astonished to know that he was still lecturing. I thought that he was long gone. And it took me months to go down there because I felt so guilty about my past. And I had a terrible fear of earthquakes at the same time and was myself trying to figure out a way to get out of Los Angeles. And I finally got up the courage with my girlfriend's encouragement to go listen to him. And he did something that he had done to others. And I often heard about it when I was working for him. He was lecturing and he looked right at me. And he said, people who have irrational fear of earthquakes because of their guilt that they're not doing anything with their lives. And yeah, I was astonished. And especially because later I found out that he could not really see us. At that time, his vision was quite poor. So he somehow had this tuning, whatever you want to call it, a harmony about himself, a Taoist kind of presence, where he repeatedly did this for people, where he would look right at them during a lecture and deliver a message that was perfectly poised for what they needed at the time. So I wanted to be a volunteer, just to do anything that I could. And my wife writes beautifully about this in her book about our friendship, which is called Making the Ordinary Extraordinary, which she was also friends with Manly Hall and worked for him as his screener, as did I. But at this point, they didn't want me at all because I had no skills to offer. Excuse me, they wanted her because she had office skills. And I had mentioned that I knew languages because I came from a family that spoke French and German and Polish and a bunch of languages. I got a phone call a couple of days later saying that Manly Hall wanted to meet me. Well, I went down there and he was sitting behind his beautiful, ornately carved Chinese desk in this huge room filled with amazing art, mostly art from the Chinese and Japanese cultures. And around him was this phalanx of white-haired old women who were his secretary, his vice president of the society, his librarian, his assistant librarian. They were all giving me the skunk eye. But Manly Hall smiled and said, come on in and make yourself miserable. And I sat down and he had this big stack of paper in front of him and he shoved it toward me and he said, this is an alchemical galley. Well, this is a galley for my alchemical bibliography. And I didn't know what alchemy was. I didn't know what a bibliography was. And I did not know what a galley was. So he explained to me it's going to be a book. This is it in its primitive form. The person who's been working on it will no longer be working on it. And I want you to take over this job. Well, I told him I have no skills, no preparation, not a good education. I mean, nothing to bring to the table. And he said, no, don't worry, you'll be fine. Just go ahead and get started and we'll keep an eye on you. I picked up the stack of papers and I walked out of his office and the vice president ran after me, went around the corner actually and blocked me. And she said, you can give me those. That was a mistake. And I said, oh, I happen to agree with you. Thank you. And I really felt a sense of relief as I handed it over, even though it was just a tremendous experience to have had. Well, by the time I got home, the phone was ringing and it was Manly Hall secretary saying he wants to see you in his office first thing in the morning. So I went down there the next morning and he was the only one sitting there. And he said to me, from now on, you will take orders only from me. And if anybody contradicts what I tell you to do, you come and tell me. And he said, you will be working on this galley, which was in front of him again. And he said, I know you can do it and I will help you. I will tell you what to do each day, give you assignments. We will go over these manuscripts and these books in my vault. And then in the evening before we go off back home, I will look at your work for the day and make sure that everything was done properly. And that way you will be able to do a great job. I'm sure you'll be fine. Well, it's truly, except for falling in love, the most amazing thing that ever happened in my life. And I just the idea that I would be able to work with him on a daily basis like that so closely, and then to be given the opportunity to inspect his collection at such close range, to be going through the books that were listed and these manuscripts, including the triangular Saint Germain Holy Trina Sophia, and just the Backstrom manuscripts, which were something like 12 or 14 volumes of handwritten alchemical notes and by a sea captain who'd been initiated off the coast of Africa into the Rosicrucian order. Just great stuff. And it's really where this book began, in that vault, having lunch with him. And I would pull books and he would tell me stories about where he got them or who the people that wrote them were. And I just found it so inspiring to see just all these people that many of whom had risked their lives to explore these esoteric paths at times when that was forbidden, and to record for us, for posterity, what they had discovered, sometimes in ciphers, but sometimes very openly, even with beautiful illustrations. And it just opened my mind to a whole alternative world that gave me hope about life.
I don't believe in coincidence. I think everything happens according to a plan. I'm not going to say whose plan it is, because each of us has our own interpretation of where that plan comes from. But this was definitely divine.
No, thank you. Yeah, I felt that way. It was amazing.
Absolutely. So your just published comprehensive masterwork is entitled American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. What inspired this phenomenal book?
It actually began in the vault, where one of the books that I pulled was, it was a very large leather-bound tome, and he wasn't actually there. I was waiting for him. And I pulled this out and I looked at it. I opened it and it said, it was a newspaper. It was like bound issues of a newspaper. But this newspaper was from something like 1885 or 1886, the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And it was published in St. Louis, and it was called The Platonist. And it was filled with translations of Plato and the Neoplatonists, such as Proclus and Plotinus, but also some esoteric writing, like a translation by Abner Doubleday, who was a Civil War general at Fort Sumter on the Union side, and who was credited, probably unwisely, with inventing the sport of baseball. But to my shock, Abner Doubleday had translated some of the works of Eliphas Levi, the French magus, who was one of the most important influences in the Western tradition, especially in Hermeticism and ceremonial magic. And the whole thing I couldn't understand how this thing existed, that while Wyatt Earp was writing around, somebody was publishing this thing. And so when I was meeting with Mr. Hall, I asked him about it, and he thought it was a wonderful mystery himself. And he said he didn't really know much about it, that Alexander Wilder, one of the principal contributors, that there were some books by him in the library with a bit of autobiographical writing, that he had been a kind of doctor, sort of an early holistic doctor. They called it eclectic medicine back then. And so he said, we don't know much about Thomas Johnson, the publisher, and we don't know much about the community that this arose in, except that we know there were connections to the New England Transcendentalists. So that got me going, searching for information all this time. Since then, I went to all these different university libraries, different places. When I was on tour, I would go to bookstores and libraries, and it took me a long time to find a book that was published in 1962 called Platonists of the Midwest, that gave me quite a bit of information about these people and showed how deeply connected they were to the New England Transcendentalists, but also how popular Plato was in those days. But that was the only work available that had any light to cast on it, and it was really raising more questions than it was answering. So I continued in the meantime exploring all these other byways because I was finding these kinds of mysteries all over the place in American history and uncovering alchemists at Harvard University and Yale, and just seeing how influential the esoteric side of it was since the very beginnings in the earliest days of colonization. And eventually, around 2000 really, but maybe picking up in the 90s, academia had a revolution in this area of study. And there was an avalanche of new research in this, this is an academic field, American metaphysical religion. The bedrock work in academia was published by Yale by a wonderful scholar named Catherine Albanese, and it's called A Republic of Mind and Spirit. And it kind of laid out this idea that there's this thing called American metaphysical religion that unites all these different, apparently unconnected and yet so similar movements and people. And so with that new research, and I was bold enough to approach the academics that were doing the research, even though a lot of people told me that they were hostile to amateur scholars. And I found nothing but support. It was really wonderful how much help I received from people who do this research. And I had made some great friends actually that way, and people who went a long way toward helping this book happen. So I kept finding this material and having this experience of thinking, if only I could walk into Manly Hall's office with this. He would have been really excited to find out that somebody finally translated that, or to discover that all that was wrong, that we read the letters of this particular queen and now there's a whole new perspective on all of this. And then I realized that there was a huge group of people out there like myself who are interested in these matters. And many of us are reading very dated studies, and we don't even know that this academic work is out there. And even if we did, we probably wouldn't be able to get hold of it because academic books are ridiculously expensive that are meant for university libraries for the most part, which few of us have access to. So it occurred to me that it would be a public service in a way to be a bridge between these wonderful historians and the people who really care about this and have enthusiasm and desire to learn about what really happened in this country. And as my research continued, just the amount of it, I could have done a book that was twice as big with all of this information. There's somebody that your listeners can follow if they're interested in this kind of stuff named Matt Marble, whose Instagram is nothing but this incredible collection of this kind of stuff, pictures and old books and just information, especially music and art related. And so then it became a desire it's almost like I was thinking of myself when I was a kid, and I thought that the only choice, if I wasn't going to go with traditional religion, was to be evil. And here was, in fact, this incredible heritage of knowledge, of exploration, of just, really courageous efforts to understand the spiritual dimension of life in America that would give almost anyone a path that was proper for them. And so that was my motivation behind it.
The passion, the curiosity, the amazing work of Ronnie Pontiac. His book, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. Ronnie, please share with our listeners where they can get your book and find out more about your work.
My book is published by Inner Traditions, and it's available everywhere at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all of those larger online, but also smaller bookstores. And I encourage people to buy from the publisher, or especially to buy from local bookstores who need all the support that they can get.
Absolutely. Anything else you'd like to share?
I'm online. You can find me there, and you'll find all my work there. Just the Google search of Ronnie Pontiac should keep you entertained for a while.
Wonderful. And we'll be back with more of Ronnie after these words on the OMTimes Radio Network.
The cutting edge of conscious radio. OMTimes Radio. IOM FM. OMTimes Magazine is one of the leading online content providers of positivity, wellness, and personal empowerment. A philanthropic organization Their net proceeds are funneled to support worldwide charity initiatives via Humanity Healing International. Through their commitment to creating community and providing conscious content, they aspire to uplift humanity on a global scale. OMTimes, co-creating a more conscious lifestyle.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Ronnie Pontiac, his brand new book, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. Ronnie, let's offer our listeners a few definitions for some of the terms they'll encounter in your book and may be vaguely familiar with. Let's start with metaphysical and esoteric.
That was the decision of what words to use is very much something that's discussed amongst authors these days in this area. Metaphysical has a bad reputation in some way. It's considered, to begin with, it's a questionable term because what is meant in academic philosophy by metaphysics and what is meant by someone who's using it in reference to a spiritual path are really quite different things. And so metaphysics, for some reason, I'm not really aware of how this happened, but I do know that it became in the last couple of years considered somewhat the term that would be used by a person trying to hustle someone online, or it sort of had a bad reputation. And of course, a cult has had a bad reputation for a very long time, although it has also been glorified. And certainly I glorified it when I was a kid. All it really means is secret. And the reason that most of this stuff was secret was because if it wasn't, you were liable to be imprisoned or worse. It was just something that it was forbidden. And then of course there's also mystical, which it seems to have a different flavor to it in the sense that I heard someone describe it as metaphysical is more active. And they felt that had more to do with people who were doing forms of magic or visualization or even perhaps more active forms of yoga. And then on the other side, mystical was more pietist or inwardly more tranquil and quiet, more like a Taoist or perhaps a Buddhist monk or something like that. Now, of course, none of these images that have become associated in our culture with these words really reflect an accurate definition for them. So it became a real question. Then esoteric, of course, was academic for the most part originally. It was a soft word to use when studying occult subjects because they were frowned upon for so long in academia. And it's still popular there, and I think it still has cachet in the sense of respecting these traditions in a way that perhaps the other words don't seem to. And so when trying to decide what to use in the title, and I do have to credit my publisher for the title and the cover, they wanted American Metaphysical Religion, and that is as I said, an academic field at this point. So it's a technical term for the very thing that I'm talking about. And then in the subtitle and the choice of what words to use, they're using esoteric and mystical rather than occult. The feeling was that occult tends to be more specialized, and I've understand that in publishing that occult content is more directed in a way as opposed to a survey of all these different traditions. Because in my book, we're looking at every nation of the world's influence on America. We're looking at every kind of spiritual path. And so the word occult seemed to be a little too precise, perhaps, even though there's quite a bit of history about occultism in America in the book.
Listeners who have not yet read your book may think it refers to 20th century New Age practices, but as you share, this has been going on for 4 centuries. What was the foundation of American metaphysical religion?
I would say the first time that you get alchemy and you get esoteric beliefs in America is with the Huguenots. And this would be in the 1500s. And I don't think that really it didn't take root deeply at the time, but it established a certain tone. Also, of course, you had amongst the trappers and those who were living lives that brought them to the American continent, they were almost like wild men or explorers at that point. They also tended to favor esoteric subjects. And they may have brought some of that with them. And there are instances. There's a famous story, for example, of in New England of a newly arrived Westerner from Europe who encounters his first indigenous American and is shocked to be addressed in English, not realizing that there had been trappers and others who had been through there teaching people how to speak English and telling them things about their religions and sharing information. So it was already going on all the way back then. And then when the whole Rosicrucian fervor in Europe was deflated by the defeat of the King of Bohemia, who was seen as this heroic figure that was going to free Europe from the clutches of the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, then we see an interest in America, which perhaps Bacon was referring to when he talked about New Atlantis. And some of these people that were involved in Rosicrucian interests, they became involved in the Virginia Company and in other very early explorations. Of course, Walter Raleigh's colony in Virginia was rife with people who had esoteric interests, although it blurs because, for instance, in my book, I talk about Thomas Harriot, and in the title, he's referred to as a, quote, evil, unquote, genius. And this is because he was really a scientist and arguably the first scientist in America, and strikes us, I think, somewhat as a modern man stuck in this early era. And he was demonized by people back home in England who saw his science as some kind of deviltry. And he had actually created an alphabet because he wanted to capture one of the indigenous languages. And then he wanted this alphabet to become a common alphabet for all languages. But in time, it instead became known as the devil's alphabet. And you'll still see it sometimes in books about devil worship or witchcraft as being described as this essentially demonic creation. And it couldn't be further from the truth. But these interests in the same kind of ideas that the Rosicrucians had in Paracelsian medicine and alchemy, in astrology, they all came over in the earliest days. And to show you how dramatic that is, even the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, so this is the Puritans, this is the Pilgrims, his son, John Winthrop the Younger, was an alchemist and astrologer with deep interest in Rosicrucianism. And in fact, when he moved to Boston to follow his father as a young man, his crates of alchemical equipment were marked with something called the Monas Hieroglyphicus, a symbol that was invented by John Dee, who was sort of Queen Elizabeth I's castle wizard and who had been sent to Europe on various missions by her and some of the things that he was trying to accomplish. And so the fact that these pilgrims were bringing over the most esoteric. I mean, John Dee's home had been burned and the library burned because an earlier generation had considered him a devil worshiper. And now those books and some of his alchemical equipment and his symbols were all being brought to America by the son of the first governor. And John Winthrop the Younger became the governor of Connecticut colony. And there he became this sort of reigning alchemical doctor whose very famous cures were keeping people healthy all throughout New England. He actually trained groups of women on how to diagnose and then what to give them, and then sent them out to doctor everyone. And he protected tribes that were being attacked by stronger tribes, and even protected them against his own fellow colonists at certain points, trying to live up to Rosicrucian ideals, what he saw as Rosicrucian ideals. So it goes way back here, and it's continued all the way through. There's never been a time when there hasn't been some kind of strong esoteric influence in this country.
How did the spiritual practices of the indigenous peoples of the Americas influence metaphysical beliefs?
That's a huge topic because it begins very early as you find cunning folk coming from Europe, and cunning folk were essentially doing the same things as witches, but for whatever reason, they were more acceptable. They were doctors. They were people you went to find things or to figure out who stole something from you, and they were okay. Whereas witches, who tended to be victimized by gender and also by their economic status, got a very different treatment, obviously. But these cunning men and women who came to America in the very earliest days would meet up there with slaves who were brought here from Africa, who had their practices, and would also meet up with the indigenous tribes who had their practices. And everybody was interested. The shamans were interested in what the others were doing and vice versa. Outside the normal bounds of church and religion, there was a great curiosity, a thirst for knowledge, the kind of thirst for knowledge that led, for example, Plotinus to follow Alexander the Great's army so that he could speak to wise people in countries that would otherwise not be available to him. Then, as we continue into the history of the country, we find, obviously we have these wars that occur. There are shamans who are claiming that they're going to hurt the colonists or hurt the people in their tribe who collaborate with the colonists. And then the colonists use their spirituality, their Christianity, to try to prove that they're more powerful and that they can't be harmed by the shamans. Although there are some very interesting records left by hostile European witnesses, Christian witnesses, about the powers of shamans and the kinds of things that they were able to do. Of course, those things were ascribed to the work of the devil. And so later on, what occurs is it's very interesting to see this progression where at first native beliefs are for the most part ignored or demonized. But you have people like Roger Williams in Rhode Island who respects what the indigenous people believe and even comes to wonder if their approach may be wiser than the approach that the Europeans take. So, for example, why should we have walls to protect our possessions when the indigenous people, they share everything alike and they don't have to have walls? And maybe that's a greater kind of wealth than hoarding while others don't have enough. So those kind of questions were being asked very early by founding fathers, questioning what the governments and societies that they were developing were going to turn into. And the founding fathers, such as Ben Franklin, certainly talked about the Iroquois Confederacy. And although there were attempts by European and American historians to say that the influence really wasn't that strong, there is a disparaging remark by Franklin who basically says, look, if these savages can run a democracy, then why can't the colonies? But evidence, especially provided by more recent authors, has shown that there really was strong influence and discussion about these Iroquois ideas regarding democracy. And I would argue that they had a superior democracy simply from the point of view that women were able to inherit property and had power and influence in a way that it would take a long time for American culture to allow. And then you see in the 1800s, as spiritualism erupts, it's on one level, it's women are claiming power through spiritualism because these women who didn't have a voice in a room with men were now able to lecture to auditoriums full of them and be taken seriously, although usually they were channeling or they were controlled by male spirits. And very often those male spirits were indigenous. And so in a weird way, there was this effort to now recast the dead indigenous people as these wise gatekeepers between the worlds that spiritualists would rely on to receive their messages or to get the appropriate people to a seance. And this was very tightly bound up in the beginning with the whole suffragette movement. And it was part of the claiming of power. And I find it so fascinating that while women were claiming power through spiritualism, that there was also this effort in coming through their unconscious or spirit or whatever one wants to call it, that was trying to bring attention to the indigenous people. And then finally, there began to be studies of exactly what these beliefs were. And some of it, for example, there's Castaneda, who I write about, and he was hugely successful and popular and strongly major influence on spirituality in the New Age. And then it turned out later, when academia finally caught up with him, that he wasn't describing Yaqui shamanism at all. And in fact, a lot of what he was presenting seemed to be his own concoctions. And he seemed to have created a fantastic work of imagination, but very poor scholarship. And there's a new study coming out about him that I'm really looking forward to. I think it's called American Trickster. And I think it's coming out in March this year. That will really blow this wide open. Last I heard, UCLA was going to publish it, but it's been worked on for many years and should provide us with a new viewpoint of Castaneda. So at any rate, and of course now these days there's a very strong interface, even though there are issues around the idea of appropriation and is it okay for Europeans to use smudge and these kind of questions. I know that most of the indigenous elders that I've spoken with and also that friends of mine have spoken to and tell me that this is what they're told. They're often told, and I was told, you were born on this land. These teachings are yours. You need to know them. They go with this land. And that's become my approach toward the idea of appropriation. I don't feel comfortable with people who pretend to be from certain traditions. And there's a long American heritage of this. I'll just use one example from the mid-century, in the 20th century, of somebody who went to Tibet and they were there for a couple of months or something. And then they came back and described themselves as a lama, when it takes over 20 years for a Tibetan to earn that designation. It's very common in America for people to just suddenly declare that they were experts in some religious field, especially that belong to other cultures. And that kind of appropriation is certainly problematic. But if sincere people are sharing information about how they achieved spiritual vision, or how they achieved tranquility, or how they were able to overcome terrible challenges in their lives, that's a beautiful thing. And one of the things that America is richest from, I think, is the interaction in our melting pot of all of these different forms, because, there's a lot of anxiety around this. There's a term in academia called Sheilaism, but they also use the term bricolage. The idea that it's not right for people to just take a little bit from Taoism and a little bit from alchemy and a little bit from tarot and a little bit from some other tradition, and then they have their own spiritual path and they think that's just fine for them. And the fear is that this is not an actual spiritual path. The fear is that this is just delusion, and that ultimately it leads to isolation. And I think the time has proven that that's not the case. And certainly there's a strong American tradition that Emerson put so beautifully when he said, and I'm going to paraphrase him, that each of us has the right to face the divine ourselves and to have that own experience. Why do we have to be imprisoned by what came before us? Or as the founder of Shingon Buddhism said, I won't say it as eloquently as he did, but essentially he said, don't seek to do what the masters did. Seek what they sought.
My guest, Ronnie Pontiac, his book, American Metaphysical Religion. We'll be back with more of Ronnie after these words on the OMTimes radio network.
Humanity Healing International is a small nonprofit with a big dream. Since 2007, HHI has been working tirelessly to bring help to communities with little or no hope. Our projects are not broad mandates, nor are they overnight solutions. but they bring the reassurance that no one is alone and that someone cares. To learn more, please visit humanityhealing.org. Humanity Healing is where your heart is.
Back on Destination Unlimited, my guest this week, Ronnie Pontiac. His new book, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. One of the things that you feature in your book is about the spiritualist communities, especially those that sprung up in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. Tell us about them, please.
It's very interesting because America has a tradition of utopian communities. Many people who came here, especially from Germany, bringing Rosicrucian and Paracelsian and Hermetic ideas, settled out in the wilderness, creating these experimental communities and trying to make heaven on earth real, some of them. And this impulse has continued throughout American history. And it certainly was part of the spiritualist movement, which began to form these little conclaves or towns of spiritualists, some of which still exist, like Lilydale. And it was both an experiment in how would a group of spiritualists live together. It turned out pretty much like anyone else. And it was a way to separate from trying to survive as a spiritualist in a potentially hostile or more urban environment where there was a lot of power in the churches and spiritualism was more frowned on. And they became almost vacation spots and wildly popular. There was 4 or 5 of them, mostly in the South because the weather was better and people liked to travel from the North to the South to these spiritualist camps. And sometimes they were literally camps. People would come and camp out, and there would be barbecued chicken and beer and mediums and metaphysical speeches. And that same structure also happened just before spiritualism with Plato. And as we talked about earlier, the newspaper, The Platonist, there were actually parties that women were having in frontier towns, celebrating Plato's birthday and writing poems and having lectures about certain dialogues. And so throughout America, there's been this impulse. And the spiritualist communities, for the most part, I think flourished. There were sometimes there would be a crisis, a fraudulent medium was discovered or something like that. But it's, I think, a testament to the quality of dedication going on there amongst most of the mediums that these have survived for as long as they have, especially Lilydale, which even has a documentary about it. And spiritualism, I think that with Edgar Cayce, it reached a new level, and he's somebody who originated some ideas that became very popular in the New Age. And he also was applying things that he was learning. So, for instance, reincarnation didn't appear in his readings until after he took some theosophical classes and encountered reincarnation. Now, does that mean that he liked the idea and then he incorporated it? Or does it mean that since his brain was now able to accept the idea of theosophy, it was now possible to channel the idea of reincarnation as presented by theosophy, that it was possible now to have him channel information that was related to reincarnation, whereas before his disbelief prevented it. So with the case of Cayce, it turned into more of a particular medium. And there had been famous mediums before, but they tended to be notorious. In his case, there was a certain level of respect and decorum, for the most part, observed. And the community that grew up around him, I think, was extremely influential in the New Age movement, and has really, I mean, some of those circulating files, for example, are filled with really wonderful information. And if you look at some of the studies on him, you can see, by academia, you can see that he was way ahead of his time in terms of healing methods and of understanding a more holistic approach to healing, and even in some of the suggestions of substances that he used for things that turned out later to be accepted by holistic medicine as valid and that many people use. And even the products that they sell out of the store there, have a very strong following that over time seems to prove that something is going on there. And then I think that we see a kind of fragmentation. I'm not sure why, but for example, in the 80s, I was fortunate enough to meet a medium by the name of the Reverend Edward A. Monroe. He was also known as the Seer of the Sun Belt. He was a retired half Cherokee LAPD police mechanic who didn't even have interest in spirituality until late in his life. And he prayed to be made use of in some way. And he got way more than he bargained for. And he would channel a spirit with a strong Scottish brogue that was incredible at medical diagnosis. And I have many, many stories, including personal stories about the way that this person was able to heal people, and also had a wonderful ethic and a strong knowledge of American metaphysical religion, which it wasn't called that at the time. But he also was somebody who contributed to my desire to do the book, because the conversations that I had with this spirit, if we want to call it that, were so filled with interesting insight and appreciation of the esoteric side of America. And he's still waiting to become known. I know that there's a big archive of his work that is at the World Research Foundation in Sedona, California, where someone named Stephen A. Ross, who used to work with Ed Monroe, has all these materials. And I hope that they'll be organized and made available someday, because I think that it's something comparable to the Casey work. But for some reason, there was never a community around it. And interestingly enough, when Stephen A. Ross asked about that, about why there was no community really forming around Ed, he was told that this was a different experiment, that they didn't want to create communities. They wanted to see what direct one-on-one influence would accomplish over time, over lifetimes. And I think there was something similar in the work of two amazing spiritualists, Stuart and Betty White, who wrote the Unobstructed Universe series of books just before and during the early years of World War II. And that, to me, is, by the way, the most stunning spiritualist story I've ever encountered. I've actually written a book about it, but it stopped right now because no one knows who owns the copyrights to these books. But these two people accomplished something that even the likes of Carl Jung and even as stoic a publication as Who's Who, for instance, did not put a date of death on Elizabeth White's entry, because they believe that she survived death. And Jung, who wrote an introduction to a German edition of the Unobstructed Universe, wrote to a friend that he believed that they had proven that she had survived as herself, as an actual spirit, not an archetype or an unconscious complex. So, but they had a very small community, and they didn't really want to have followers. They would answer letters, but they always told people that they could find out for themselves what they needed to know. It reminds me very much of Manly Hall, who was often asked to become a teacher for individuals who met with him. And he always would say that your life is your teacher. Your experiences are your teacher. The people you encounter, that's your teacher. Nature is your teacher.
Everything is a teacher as long as you have curiosity.
Exactly.
A 2021 Pew Research finding was that 30% of Americans said they had no religious affiliation. Do you think that this will grow and that American metaphysical religion could become an organized religion?
I think it's possible. I almost hope it doesn't, because it's in a way, it's so blessed right now to be unaware of itself. That's the one downside of my book is that what happens when it becomes aware of itself. It opens up a lot of opportunities for exploitation, unfortunately. But I think that there is a trend away from organized religion. I think that there's a realization, especially through the internet now, that the spiritual riches of all ages and cultures are now available to us to peruse. And this is an exciting thing. It is certainly exciting to follow the tradition that you've been born into, but it's also very exciting to be able to experience a bunch of different traditions and perhaps choose what you like best, which one you like best, or choose elements of each. Or someone might find themselves practicing Buddhism at one point in their lives, and then maybe much later on they are practicing perhaps some kind of pietist Christianity, or they may go fully into tarot and astrology and omen reading. Or it's the path. Your choices on the spiritual path have multiplied so much that I think that's part of the reason that this is happening. And I do think that it's possible that I do think definitely we will see more people getting into American metaphysical religion, because we can see in the younger generations, if you go on TikTok, there is so much activity. There is such a thirst for knowledge about these subjects. And many of them don't have much interest in being taught by established traditions. They all want to discover and share, which is rather wonderful and very typical of American metaphysical religion.
My guest is Ronnie Pontiac. His new book, American Metaphysical Religion, Esoteric and Mystical Traditions of the New World. Ronnie, one more time, please tell our listeners where they can get this fabulous book and find out more about you and your work.
You can get the book from my publisher, Inner Traditions. It's also available from Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, and all of the larger online outlets. And it should be available in a number of bookstores as well. And I encourage people to support their local bookstores. And as far as my work, if you just Google Ronnie Pontiac, you'll see all kinds of things to check out. There's films, because I've worked on documentaries. There's music, and there's various kinds of writing. And there will be lectures coming up that I can't say much about at this point. But if you follow me on Instagram or Facebook, you will definitely hear about them.
Ronnie, thank you so much for joining us and sharing this amazing work that you've done.
Thank you so much for having me here, Victor. It was a wonderful experience.
And thank you for joining us on Destination Unlimited. I'm Victor, the Voice Fuhrman. Have a wonderful week.